Hello and welcome to today's session. My name is Jody Williams. I am the Indigenous Education Lead for Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board, and I'm very excited to have back with us today Morris Switzer. And hopefully you have been doing some learning this past week. Last week has been recognized officially as Treaties Recognition Week, which is a time to learn a little bit more about this really important relationship. It's the foundation of Canada. And perhaps you don't know, but yesterday is marked as Indigenous Veterans Day, as we're approaching November 11th, which is Remembrance Day. But there is actually a day marked specifically for Indigenous veterans. And Morris is going to talk a little bit about that as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce Morris. We've known each other for quite a few years now. He's an author of, perhaps you may have heard of the book, We Are All Treaty People. He's also authored two other books. One he's going to share with us today, his most recent work. And he's been doing treaty education for quite a long time, has worked in a variety of capacities in communications, in the news area, and just a real wealth of information. So we're very excited to have you on here with us, Morris. Before I turn it over to you, just to let you know, if we will be doing a Q&A in the chat box on the YouTube side of things. So we invite you to put your questions in there. You can ask questions during the session in the chat box, and then we will, at the end of the talk, go back through those, or if they happen, or if you have more questions that come up, you can put those in there as well. It's wonderful to see all the people who are letting us know where they are tuning in from. So it's great to have you all with us. And I'm going to turn it over now to Morris to introduce himself and get started for the day.
Oh, thanks very much, Jody. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be here. And I'm talking to you now from North Bay, which is about 300 miles north of where you are. And in other years, I have come down and actually been in classrooms and spoken to students in your board, and and I miss that personal contact. And but on the other hand, using this technology helps get our messages and our stories out to far more people. So I guess that sort of offsets it. But I'm hoping you're all doing well in this different time, this COVID time, and I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. We're getting some nice warmer weather up here in North Bay for November. It's been about 17 degrees. I was out for a hike yesterday in the woods, and it was quite warm. So I hope everybody down there is following the rules, because we don't want people to be sick. But I hope you're managing to find enjoyable things to do. It's one of the best things to do, and the safest things to do is to be outside. And I think that's being proven even when we don't have COVID to worry about. That it's more and more teachers are taking their students outside to learn, because there's tend to be good results with that. So I welcome you all here, and thank you for you and your teachers for taking the time to listen to what I have to say today. And this is last week, as Ms. Williams said, last week was officially Treaties Recognition Week. But it's important for everybody to remember treaties every day, not just 1 week a year, but every day. If every day of the year was Treaties Recognition Day, we wouldn't have some of the challenges that maybe some of you have seen on the news, when Indigenous peoples are not getting our treaty rights or our treaty promises kept the way they started out. So, and many Indigenous peoples, when we kind of laugh when people talk about celebrating Thanksgiving Day, because we say every day of our lives is Thanksgiving Day. So we're going to talk about how treaties started, and this story is a little book that I helped create for the Near North District School Board up here in North Bay, and I wrote the words and the story, and a good friend of mine named Jack Smallboy, who is from the Moosonee area, a lot further north than here. He's a very talented artist, and he created the pictures. But before we get into the story, I'm going to introduce myself in my language. Miss Williams was good enough to give you a bit of my background. But it's appropriate that when Indigenous peoples meet other groups like you, that we use our language and introduce ourselves. And I'll explain after what I've said. Ani bojo, Benezi Dishnakas, Wajash Dodam Anashnabek, Anguaro Dodam Hodnashoni, Alderville Donjiba, North Bay Endayan, and Ashnabek and Dow. So I said greetings, and I said I'll call you Niji, I'll call you friends. I said that the name I've been given is Benesi, which is a short version of Nimki Benezi, which means Thunderbird. That's a name I was given, and some First Nations people get names given to them at their birth or a bit later, and I was given mine quite a bit later. And when I think of my name, our name is supposed to, if it's properly chosen, it might indicate some of the work we're going to do in our life. And the Thunderbird is our legends. The Anishinaabeg legends are that when you hear a thunderstorm, we can imagine a giant bird flapping its wings to make that sound of thunder, and that helps bring the rain that nourishes the earth. So, and I said that I have two clans. Many peoples around the world identify their families by clans. Scottish people do. They wear certain plaids to denote their clans. And Indigenous peoples, our clans are usually identified by animals and birds in the territory where we live. So one of my clans through my grandfather, my mother's father, is muskrat, Wajashk. And there are many legends and stories about that little animal. And my great grandmother on my mother's side was a woman named Esther Hill from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, and so that's Haudenosaunee, and I'm a Wolf clan through her. And I said that my family roots are in Alderville, the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, and you're on Mississauga territory, where you are down near Brampton. And Mississauga people traditionally lived all along the north shore of the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Ontario, I should say. And Alderville is near it's east of Cobourg, Ontario, which is east of where you are. And my grandfather Moses Muskrat Marsden was the chief there for a number of years in the early part of the 20th century. And he helped fight to get treaty recognition for that community. And I said that I'm living in North Bay. I've been here about 20 years. I do a lot of work in schools and with students of different at different levels, and largely talking about the treaties. That's been a favorite subject of mine for a number of years. I still study, I still learn. Almost every day I learn something that I didn't know the day before. And I said that that I'm proud to be a citizen of the Anishinaabeg Nation. And the Anishinaabeg nation covers most of Ontario. Our traditional territories cover most of Ontario, and there are Anishinaabe people even out into Manitoba and parts of Saskatchewan. So, so that's who I am. And as I say, I want to tell you this story that it talks about treaties, and when people, and I'm going to share that story with you right now. And this little book that we created, we called it Grandpa, What is a Treaty Anyway? And a treaty, some people think of a treaty as a contract or some legal thing, and it is. It's all of that. It has a legal importance. But in simple terms, and sometimes people complicate issues by trying to think of all sorts of fancy words and titles and descriptions. But basically, a treaty is a promise. And a treaty can be between two nations. Remember, I said I was a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation. Nations are like countries, and usually agreements between countries and nations often come in the form of treaties. And Canada, for example, is part of treaties about trading with other countries, including the United States and Mexico, and there are treaties that the countries around the world form to say we're all going to work together to try to make the climate better. There are treaties about peace treaties are the more common ones, like we promise that we're not going to have wars with one another. So treaties are quite common. And Indigenous peoples in North America, they were making treaties with one another before people came here from other parts of the world, mainly Europe. And they would have treaties to make sure that they respected one another's hunting areas, and they didn't have fences in those days. They didn't need them. They had landmarks. They knew, they knew where one another's hunting areas were. But they had these treaties, agreements amongst themselves. And it says that this story was written by me, Morris Switzer, and it says it was illustrated by, I mentioned earlier, Jack Smallboy. And Jack is an extremely talented artist, and he actually went to a residential school. And I don't know whether your classes at your age have studied residential schools, but Indigenous children were forced to go to these schools for many years. They were literally taken away from their parents. And it's not a happy chapter in Canada's history. And Jack went from when he was about, I think he was about 8 years old, for about 8 years. And but he's a very talented artist. And I just want to call your attention to what's on the cover of this book. You can see a paper treaty and an old quill pen made out of a feather. That's how they used to write many years ago. And that's how the European people would write down the terms of a treaty, of the promises that they were making, of the agreement. But the Indigenous peoples, they couldn't read or write English, and they had other ways of understanding what these promises meant. And there would have been translators to translate the English language, so the Indigenous peoples would have some understanding. And in the same way, going the other direction, there would have been translators to tell the Europeans what the Indigenous peoples were saying in their language. And unfortunately, there's always something lost in translations because the difference in how languages are made. And the other main item on this cover is very important because it's called a pawagan in Anishinaabe language. It's a pipe. And pipes were very sacred objects and still are to many Indigenous peoples. And what you put in the pipe is a tobacco or a sema. That's the Anishinaabe word. And tobacco is regarded by many nations of Indigenous peoples, and there are many across Canada, Many of us regard it as a sacred plant because we've been taught that the tobacco plant was the first plant that was given to us by God, by the Creator. And we use that tobacco, not the kind of tobacco you get in stores that's full of poisonous chemicals and addictive things, but tobacco that some places is still grown purely as a plant. The leaves are dried and made into tobacco, and it would be put in pipes, or it could be just given to someone. If someone asks a favor of another person, you give them tobacco because because that plant is so important. It's a sign of great respect. If you're a hunter at this time of year and you're an indigenous hunter and maybe you shoot a moose, many hunters have a little ceremony where they put down some tobacco, and that's really thanking the Creator, thanking God, and thanking the moose for giving up its life. So it's a way to express your thanks, ask for a favor, and when it's smoked, it's like praying. And so when pipes are smoked, we're taught and you don't need to inhale. The important thing is making the smoke, go up. We believe that our prayers and promises go up in that smoke to the Creator. So when, as happened at many treaty meetings, the newcomers, the settlers, the colonizers who wanted to make a treaty shared that pipe. It was often called a peace pipe. When it was shared with the indigenous peoples who had lived here for thousands of years, that meant that they were agreeing that the promises they were making to each other would last, as you would say if you were in court giving evidence. You would say, I'm promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. So that's a very important thing, that pipe, and you'll see it a bit later. So it says here that understanding treaties is part of our collective journey in learning about the country we live in, Canada, and our nation's history. And treaties are part of our collective identity. We hope that this story helps our students to better understand the nature of treaty relationships. We are all treaty people. And that last little sentence is very important because some people think that it's only Indigenous peoples that have any treaty rights. But all of you who are listening to me right now, you all have treaty rights. And everybody who is involved in a treaty, and that literally means everybody in Canada, because the treaties were largely about sharing all of the land that we call Canada. And all of those agreements involved Indigenous peoples who had been the only people that lived here for thousands of years. And when new people came here about 500 years ago and started asking if the Indigenous peoples would share the land, that's when treaties started to be made. And so everybody is responsible for the promises made in those treaties and for keeping them and for looking after the land that we're sharing. So just please remember, we're all treaty people. So this story is about the eagle family. And you have to imagine is when you see cartoons and animated stories, they often take animals, maybe SpongeBob SquarePants is a good example, who's an ocean sponge, and they give them human characteristics. And sometimes that helps us understand the stories better. So this story is about an elderly man who we have to imagine was a bald eagle, and actually Jack made him really bald. You can see a little bald spot on top of his feathered heads. And bald eagles in nature, they start changing, their feathers start changing color when they're about 6 years old, and that's when they mature, and all the feathers on their around their head turn white. And so this man's name is McGeezy Eagle. And Magizi is an Anishinaabemowin Ojibwe word for eagle, so his name is really Eagle Eagle in English. And every day after school, and some of you when times are normal, and some of you maybe now, drop in to see a relative or a friend after school. And every day after school, his granddaughter, whose name is Phoenix, drops in and has milk and cookies before she goes home. And it's good company for her grandpa. And so you can see he's getting ready, pouring her milk and getting her cookies ready on the counter there. And Phoenix comes in, and she obviously had something that she wants to talk to him about that she learned at school today. And so dropping in for her after school milk and cookie snack, Phoenix Eagle asked, "Grandpa, what is a treaty anyway?" Because her wise old grandpa has many answers that maybe even her mommy and daddy don't know. So they sit down, and he starts to tell her this story. And he says, "Well, my child, treaty is a fancy word for a promise. And the humans who came to these shores from far away used it when they first came here." And you can see, and in our story, things that are happening a long time ago, we've put them in black and white. And it's like Grandpa Eagle is remembering them. And again, the people who came to what we call Canada today, most of them came from countries in Europe like England and France and Spain and Italy and other countries like that, mainly England and France. And they came in boats, and it was very difficult voyage. Many people actually got sick and died on the voyage because those boats aren't very big and the ocean is very rough, and it would take them weeks to get across. And they came to the shores of what's now Canada, and you can see the Indigenous peoples greeting them. And they usually, almost always, if people came in peace, they were welcomed. And because those people were tired and sick, and they came from not very good conditions back home, if it wasn't for the fact that the Indigenous peoples helped them find food and plants that they could use to cure illnesses, and showed them what you could eat and how to hunt, and showed them how to travel. They showed them how to build a canoe and things like that. If they hadn't have shared their knowledge with the newcomers, many of them, most of them probably would have died. So that's how Canada really started, and it was a friendly relationship. So so now they're right into their snack, and you can see Magizi, Grandpa Eagle, he's got some steam coming out of his cup, so I don't know whether it's coffee or hot chocolate or tea. So Phoenix is munching away on her cookies, and she looks up at her wise old grandfather, and she says, "But what were those promises about?" Remember, Grandpa told her that treaty is a fancy word for promise. So she said, "What were the promises about?" So here, in the next 2 pages here, Magizi, Grandpa Eagle, remembers when he was a young bird flying high. You can see him up in the left there, flying high above a big meeting. And this was a treaty gathering, and there were 2 groups of people. And again, and once the European people got settled here and had little villages, they realized that they needed some sort of agreements because they knew they were on somebody else's land. So they had to make some kind of agreements. And back home in Europe, they called agreements with other nations treaties. So the leaders of these settlements, and they, at first they were French from France, and then later in the 1700s, most of them were from Britain, what we call Britain, which is England and those islands, the British Isles. And they started, as they wanted to make more settlements and go west across what's now Canada, they started having these meetings, treaty gatherings with the Indigenous peoples in those different areas. And this would be a typical meeting that took place. And you can see there was at the left, you can see a fort, because the settlers would build forts in which there might be a few soldiers to protect them, to act kind of like a local police force, and at which they would do trading, often with the Indigenous peoples, who they called Indians in those days. And the Indians would trade, maybe things that they had hunted or grown, like corn or fish or different things. And the fur trade came to be a very big thing, and they might trade their furs at the fort, and they would get things that they didn't have. They might get things like foodstuffs, like flour. They might get things that were already made that they would have to make by hand, things like blankets. Metal things were very important, like kettles and pots and pans, and sometimes guns that make it easier for them to hunt instead of using bows and arrows and things. So that's the fort. And we only put one color in this historic photo, and that's the mounted policeman who's there representing again what we called the crown. And again, these settlers would have represented the British government and king and crown. And you can see people we would call treaty commissioners who were arranging the words and making the promises on the treaties. And the promises might include things like, if you agree to share your land with us, we are going to give you some money to buy things, and we are going to maybe give you in exchange, maybe plows to plow fields, or maybe some guns, or it was like a promise to do things for the Indigenous peoples in exchange for their promise to share the land. And they would also promise, if there were any enemies that attacked, that they would fight that enemy together. They would be allies if there were any wars. So, and you can see the man shaking the hand of an Indian chief. Now, he's the one that has the feather. They called it a headdress or bonnet. This would have been in Western Canada, maybe Saskatchewan or Manitoba or Alberta areas today, because that's the kind of headdress out of eagle feathers that those chiefs out there wore. And they're shaking hands, and that's a sign of that treaty promise. When you shake hands with someone, that's a sign of what you're saying is the truth. And you can see what the chief is holding. Remember, we talked about that pipe? So he's holding one of those pipes, and to make sure that these promises are going to be kept, they're going to, after they go through the exercise of agreeing to what the promises are, they will smoke that pipe together, everybody involved, and that will make sure that the promises are going to be kept, they hope. And McGee's Eagle is remembering all this, and he smiles, and he recalls the dancing. You can see in the background there's dancing, and it's like a powwow today. There'd be big ceremonies and celebrations. You can see some people around a big drum, and they're singing. And these were sacred songs and dances. That's at powwows. Those songs they have a sacred meaning. And he remembers the smoke billowing up into the air from many fires where the Indigenous peoples had set up their camps, their teepees, their tents, and from the pipes below. So the smoke would be coming up from those pipes. So you can see on this page, you can see what a typical treaty gathering might have looked like, and the promises that were made. A typical promise, they would say, would end with something like, and we promise that we will keep our promises to you, the Indigenous peoples, for as long as the grass grows, for as long as the rivers run, and as long as the sun shines. So that means forever. So most of these promises were made about 250 years ago, and then right up into about 100 years ago, the series of treaties that, and they're important because if it weren't for the agreements by the Indigenous peoples who had lived here alone for thousands and thousands of years, this was all their land. If they hadn't agreed to share it, there wouldn't be a Canada like we know today. And I know we celebrate Canada Day on July 1st, but that never would have happened, what we call Confederation on July the 1st, 1867, about 150 years ago. That wouldn't have happened if 100 years earlier, through all these treaties, the Indigenous peoples hadn't agreed to share the land. Can't have a country without any land. And then on the other side of this image, you can see McGeezy Eagle, Grandpa Eagle, remembering what happened as a result of the treaty. And this shows there's an Indian or Indigenous teepee or wigwam in the foreground, but then you can see that land becoming settled because they'd agreed to share it. And you can see in the background a settler out plowing a field, and you can see a covered wagon, and you can see their wooden houses. You can see a team of horses. This is how Canada first became a country as you know it today, with newcomers coming from mainly, as I said, places like England, and starting farming was the big activity, because that's what they had done back home in Europe. So McGeezy remembers. He said the newcomers wanted to share the land with the people who had always lived here, and they promised to share it and take care of it forever, as long as the grass grows and the sun shines. And you have to remember too that at this time when these treaties were being signed, there weren't too many people from Europe here. They were really outnumbered by the Indigenous peoples at this time. In as late as the start of the 1800s, there would only be maybe 10,000 European people in all of what we call Canada, and there were many, many, many more times that of Indigenous peoples. So Phoenix is listening to all this, and she's having a drink of her milk, and she thought for a minute and then asked, well, okay, her grandpa's talked about these promises, so how do they work? She's not quite sure yet how they work. So she washes down her last bite of cookie with a gulp of ice cold milk. Well, her grandpa McGeezy said, you and your mom and dad, you make promises to each other all the time. You do chores. I see you help your mom dry the dishes, and I see you help your dad take out the garbage, and they do some nice things for you too, don't they? So when I talk about this story with students, I ask them, what chores do you do? And some of them, if they live on a farm, they help with the animals. Well, I remember one little boy saying he helped with the goats. Some kids say they help keep their room tidy. Their mom has showed them how to put their own clothes in the washer and dryer. But almost all of the kids I've talked to, they do things to help around the house. And when I ask them, well, what do your mom and dad do for you? Some kids, funny, they say, well, I don't get anything. And I think they think I'm talking about money. Some families can afford allowance, some families can't. But I say to them, well, you don't sleep out on the lawn, do you? Like your mom and dad give you, they don't charge you for your meals, do they? So, they give to their children, and and Phoenix recognizes that, and she said, well, yes, Mom, we have a treat. Sometimes Mom makes pizza for supper, and sometimes Dad takes us to the movies. Some kids, they get to play hockey and other things, and their parents drive them and buy them equipment and figure skating and other sports and all sorts of activities, and travel sometimes. We don't travel very much these days because of this COVID thing, but most of us have been pretty lucky. And Phoenix said, well, yeah. She said, and I also get my very own bedroom. And it's not every, that's very lucky. I was always lucky because I was an only child. I think Phoenix is an only child. If you have a big family, you're not always lucky. Sometimes have to share your room with brothers and sisters. So there you go, says Grandpa McGeezy. You already have a treaty started with your mom and dad. And he means they do some things for you and you do some things for them. And that's what a treaty is doing things with treaty partners and making promises and keeping promises. So Phoenix is wiping the crumbs from her fingers and she's heading out the door home and she says, cool, I like promises, especially when they involve pizza. So Grandpa is washing the few little dishes, and Phoenix has learned an important lesson about how Canada started. It started with treaties, but treaties are just promises. Now, that's a picture of myself, and that was drawn by Jack, and you can see that handshake. That's how Canada started, and it started on those promises. Now, unfortunately, a lot of those promises that were made to the Indigenous peoples have not been kept. And, you might, I don't know how many of you watch the news regularly, but there's good examples of those promises not being kept right now out on the East Coast. The Mi'kmaq people who have been fishing for lobster for thousands and thousands of years, because the treaty that they signed, that they agreed to, promised that they would be, it would recognize that they would be able to continue to do what they'd always done. The newcomers wouldn't interfere with that. Now some of the non-Indigenous fishers are kind of jealous because they don't have the same right to fish all the time that the Indigenous peoples have, that was agreed to in a treaty hundreds of years ago. And I think if those people who are so upset about the Mi'kmaq fishermen enjoying their treaty rights, if they had taken the things that you're taking in school right now, they would maybe have a better opinion and understanding. But you have to understand that you're the very first generation of students in this country who are learning about a lot of these issues, because up until very recently, the things that are being taught in school didn't talk much about Indigenous peoples or treaties or some unhappy things like residential schools, but some really very positive things, like there was only ever one war fought in Canada, and that was the War of 1812. And the great heroes of that war were largely Indigenous people who fought to defend Canada. So there are many stories about this country's history that haven't been taught in school, and as a result, a lot of adults don't understand as much as you're learning about things like treaties. So you're going to be able to teach the adults in your family about things they didn't know. I was never taught all of the things I'm sharing with you. I wasn't taught in school. I've had to learn on my own in about the last 25 or 30 years. So that's that story. And if you look underneath our handshake, you see what's supposed to be what we call a wampum belt. And these were woven out of beads that were taken from shells and strung and made it. And they would tell stories. They would have pictures of people woven into them, sometimes buildings. And that was how Indigenous peoples recorded the treaties, because remember I said they didn't write things down on paper. But they regarded these wampum belts as very sacred items, and they were able to remember what was on them, for hundreds and hundreds of years after the treaties had been made, and still do. And one of the things that we remember every year at this time, and I'm gonna stop first of all, I'm gonna put my glasses on, and then I'm gonna stop my sharing. And Miss Williams is going to put up some slides that talk about other things that we remember. We should remember the treaty promises, but you heard me mention the Great War, the only war ever fought on Canadian soil, called the War of 1812. And a lot of students are surprised to find out who the war was between, because Canada was invaded by people who are now considered our closest friends and neighbors, the United States. And the United States had started out as a colony of Britain, of England, they didn't want to be a colony anymore, or part of that British Empire or colony. And Canada is still part of the British Commonwealth, they call it now, because we have our own governments and our own constitution and our own laws. So we're not a colony anymore. That's how we started. And but we remember. It's very important that we remember. And as I said earlier, every day should be Treaty Recognition Day, and every day should be Remembrance Day. Nobody likes wars. Wars are horrible things. They're horrible ways to settle differences or disputes between countries. But we have to remember and really be grateful to people who have defended our country in times of war. And so this week is as Ms. Williams mentioned, actually yesterday officially was National, they used to call it Aboriginal Veterans Day, but it's Indigenous Veterans now. And the poppy is a sign of remembrance, because that's the flower that grew in the fields in Europe. You might, in your class, hear the poem that Colonel John McCrae wrote near the end of the First World War: "In Flanders fields the poppies blow." And so this is Remembrance Day week. And if we go to the next one. Nobody has defended the lands on which Canada was created more than Indigenous peoples, First Nations warriors, we call them here. And Tecumseh was one of the Indian leaders. There were about 10,000 Indigenous warriors, we would call them soldiers today, who were Canada's defense. They were our army in the War of 1812, and Tecumseh was one of them. And there are others from, many of them from near where I live, up in Northern Ontario. Their names were Meskwaki and Pakinawattik and Siganak and Oshawanu and Shawundas. You've never heard these names because they weren't in the history books. Remember, I said the history books didn't have a lot of information about what really happened in the first 150 years of Canada and before. And you might have heard names like Sir Isaac Brock, who was the political and military leader of the colony that was becoming Canada. But he didn't have much of an army, and he relied on the making friends with the Indigenous peoples. And you have to remember that they had promised in those treaties to defend against enemies of the people they signed the treaty with, the British. So they kept their treaty promises. And in more modern times, nobody has defended Canada more than the people from First Nations communities, Métis people, Inuit people, who volunteered, even though they didn't have to. They had part of their treaty agreements, and were that they would defend. But they weren't obliged to when the government brought in what's called the Indian Act. That excluded Indigenous peoples from having to volunteer or enlist, but they did. They volunteered. And Corporal Francis Pegamagabo, who later became a chief of his First Nation in Wissahickon First Nation, which is near Parry Sound, Ontario, he was a great hero. And he was a sniper, and he was a good sniper with a rifle, because when he was home, he had to use a rifle to supply food for his family. And most Indigenous peoples were very good with weapons because they needed them. They didn't have grocery stores. They hunted and fished for their food. And in World War II, Sergeant Tommy Prince was one of the most decorated Canadian soldiers, had the most medals, as did Corporal Francis Pegamagabo, more than just about any other Canadian soldier. And he also fought in the Korean War, which is another war about 1952. So these are great heroes. Okay, and I'll show you one more slide. So we, in the same way as that we put monuments up to heroes. Sometimes, unfortunately, we find out that they weren't great heroes. Like poor old Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister, they're taking down monuments to him because he did a lot of things, particularly to Indigenous peoples, that weren't very nice. But that's for you to learn about in a bit later grades. And there is a big war memorial, and if you're watching TV on Remembrance Day, I think that's this Wednesday, yes, Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock. That's the traditional end of World War I, and it's on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That was officially when the first Great World War was over, and we still pay homage to our soldiers who have defended Canada. But it was thought that because the Indigenous peoples had defended Canada in greater numbers per capita, because their population wasn't great, but they volunteered in higher numbers than any other group, that there would be a special, they called it Aboriginal Veterans Monument in downtown Ottawa and the capital. And you can see some symbols there, bears and eagles. The bear is a symbol in most of our Indian nations, Indigenous nations, as a protector. And so yesterday officially was National Aboriginal Indigenous Veterans Day, and I saw things on Facebook about people whose relatives had fought for Canada. And on the right, there's a cenotaph, which is another word for a monument, a war monument, in Alderville First Nation, which is where my family is from. And that's been there almost 100 years, built sometime after the First World War. And they have put the names of, inscribed the names on that monument of everybody from that community who has fought for Canada. And I have names of 3 uncles and a great uncle and my grandfather on there. My grandfather was too old at the time of World War I, 1914, to actually be an active soldier, but he formed a military band, and they went around and supported the war effort and made people aware of it and raised people's spirits in communities in that area in Southern Ontario. And just to give you an idea of the extent to which Indigenous peoples have contributed to keep Canada and their lands safe from any enemies. In 1914, at the time of the First World War, when Britain and Canada were involved, became involved, there were 63 men living in Alderville First Nation. 63. It was a very small community. 38 of those 63 men volunteered to serve in the Army. Canadian Army. There were some First Nations, a little one near Oshawa, Ontario, called Scugog First Nation. There were about 25 men in the community. Every single one of them volunteered to serve for Canada. So Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis Nunavut, we have kept our treaty promises. We have protected Canada. We have shared the land. And I hope you're going to be learning in the days ahead in your school that we're still waiting for the governments of Canada and the provincial governments to keep the promises that were made. And when I said we are all treaty people, all of you are treaty people. You live in communities where there are nice paved roads, where there are big schools, where nice hospitals, nice hockey arenas and baseball fields, and you have all of those things because Indigenous peoples agreed to share the land with your ancestors. But many Indigenous peoples still live on little reserves that when the treaty promises started to become kind of tarnished, they ended up being forced into these little tiny reserves, and they didn't have a lot of those things that people outside enjoyed. And for example, there are many First Nation people living on reserve who don't have access to such a basic human right as clean drinking water. So you might have seen a story a couple of weeks ago about a whole community in Northwest Ontario that had to be evacuated because they had been on a boil water advisory for 25 years, 26 years. They had not had safe drinking water. And so we have to, if Canada is going to be the really great country that we know it is, it has to make sure that the promises that were made to help share the use of this wonderful land with Indigenous peoples, that those promises are kept. And when you students are the prime ministers and premiers and judges and you know, and lawyers and journalists, when you're the people who are, and the leaders of business, when you're the people who are running Canada, as you will be someday, you have to understand today, as you're the first students to learn about many of these things in the country's history, that it's through that knowledge that you can make Canada better for everybody that lives here, not just some people, but everybody. Everybody's a treaty person, and everybody deserves to have a share in the wonderful opportunities and wealth that Canada has today. So I thank you very much for participating, and I'm only too glad to answer questions that Ms. Williams is going to field for me. So miigwech, nyawa.
Thank you so much, Morris, for that beautiful book and sharing that book with us, and all of the information today that you've shared. So I'm going to invite people to put their questions in the chat box. We have had some come up during the time that you were talking. So I'll just scroll back up here. Just gotta find it. Here it is. It says, my students are wondering how they made wampum belts. What were they made out of?
I don't know whether you'll be able to see this very clearly. Not very. Can you see it?
Yes.
That's a shell. That's called a quag shell, quahog. And wampum beads were made from these shells often. They made at different times, if they didn't have shells, sometimes they made wampum belts out of eagle claws, sometimes out of porcupine quills. But when they had access of these shells that were mainly found on the east coast of Canada, near where there was very first people from Europe landed, the people there started using the beads in different ways. And I'll hold this. This is kind of hard for you to see, but this is I'll put it in front of my face.
Yes.
You can see this is a string of 20 wampum beads, and they had to be chipped out of the shell by hand. And you have to remember that a couple of hundred years ago or more, when they first started making them, more than hundreds of years ago, they had to do that work without metal tools, maybe pieces of bone or a rock. And it's very difficult. They said in those days it might have taken a woman 2 days to make one finished bead. And they all have to be the same size because they're woven on a loom. And if they're not the same size, you couldn't do the work. It wouldn't work. And they had to drill a tiny, tiny hole in them where they're not really 100% sure how they did that because they didn't have drills or metal pointy objects. And so that shows how special they were, that it would take a woman 2 days to make one bead. And the big wampum belts, some of them, I have one that's 10,076 beads in. You can see behind me, there's an image of a wampum belt. It's called the dish with one spoon. And that was a treaty between First Nations before Europeans got here. And again, the messages that were woven into them were very, very simple, but they had very profound meanings. And this is called the dish with one spoon because those black beads represent a dish. And in the middle, some people interpret the white beads inside the dish as a spoon. I've heard of other First Nations that interpret that as a beaver tail, as something they eat. And the message was the same, that when these two nations, the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee, decided to end decades of war, they said there's enough game in our territories for both of us to share. And so they told very profound messages, but they were limited to how complicated they could make the images in the belts. So, and those belts have lasted for hundreds of years and are still taken out on very special occasions to talk about. So that's how they made them. And they're more in the eastern part of Canada, closer to the ocean, where many of these shells are found. And they also believed that because these shells came from the water, because water is a very sacred element, it's the lifeblood of the earth and of each of us, we can't live without water, that also made these beads very sacred objects. So any belt made out of them would have the same sacred significance. So they're regarded as really important by First Peoples. So and unfortunately, at different times, some of these sacred items were confiscated, and you'll learn more about that later in your studies. But they were really important in the history of what we call Canada.
And I'm not sure, maybe you mentioned this already, Morris, but these are the same as written documents, because a lot of people today think about contracts or agreements as, having pieces of paper with text on it that you sign. But these belts, and also we should maybe clarify, belts are not like wear around your pants belts, but that these are the same as written documents.
Yes, and the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that oral or spoken remembrance of events and of history is just as valid as written events. And just because things are written down does not make them automatically the truth. And unfortunately, there have been the reason why a lot of treaty promises have been broken is that the way that they were written down was not the way they were spoken to the Indigenous peoples. And there are many examples, if we had time to point out, that things that have been written in history are basically were written down by people whose job it was to make their ruler, their king, look good. So just because a lot of history is written down doesn't mean it's accurate, doesn't mean it's truthful. So more and more courts in today's age are recognizing that oral history or history that's recorded in different ways, such as on wampum belts, is legitimate evidence or versions of the past.
Another question here is, this is a good one. Why did Turtle Island change to Canada?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you for the questions. Many Indigenous people still call North America Turtle Island, and that's based on some of our old teachings about how the world began. And that if you look at North America in a certain way, you can almost see Mexico. It looks like the tail of the turtle, and the right front paw, I believe, is Labrador, and So there are, but there are many teachings about how the world began, and indigenous teachings, and many of them are similar. Not all of them, because one of the great myths is that all indigenous peoples are the same. We're not. The people on the West Coast have different creation stories than we do here. But there are, I know the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people, who are major nations in what we call Ontario, that their creation stories are similar in that they talk about this turtle's back, the continent formed on a giant turtle's back. So, and the word Canada, incidentally, is from an Iroquoian word, Canada, as there's so many other place names, Ontario, Ottawa, Nipissing, the lake I live beside. Those are all indigenous words. Canada, it said, originally was an Iroquoian word meaning village. So when we think about how places evolved, again, Turtle Island is from indigenous creation stories, as opposed to the stories that you might study in the Bible that are parables about how the world was created. But indigenous people have our own stories about how the world was created. But but many of us still call it Turtle Island, even though other people call it Canada.
Another question here is in regards to, you had spoken about tobacco being sacred. Are there other plants that are sacred and part of ceremonies? This is coming from a grade 4 or 5 class. And maybe just to tag on, it's important to note that all plants are sacred. There's some confusion, I think, that comes up when we start to designate only certain plants as sacred and not others. But certainly tobacco is very important, but not the tobacco that you're probably thinking about. It's not the cigarette, the bad tobacco. So if you want to elaborate on that one.
Yeah. All life is sacred, and that it's a gift. That's why every day is supposed to be Thanksgiving. We're supposed to thank the Creator every day for the life that we have when we open our eyes. And so in that way, yes, everything has a spirit, everything is alive. We're all related, not just human beings, but we're all related to everything that's alive. We're all connected. But we've been taught that certain plants are used for ceremonies, and the Anishinaabe people are taught that we have 4 sacred medicines: the sweetgrass, cedar, tobacco, and sage, and they're used in certain ceremonies. You've probably seen smudging take place, which is, they're basically purification ceremonies. And they now, by the way, these things have existed for thousands of years, but now scientists have actually done tests, and they find that there are practical reasons for using these medicines in smudging, because it actually has been found to purify molecules in the air that may contain germs. But those are the Anishinaabe sacred medicine. That doesn't apply necessarily to any other nations. Not all nations necessarily smudge. It might not be part of their custom. And the reason for these difference in practices is it depends on where you live and what and the plants that are there, and the plants that we believe were given to us by the Creator. So it's not surprising that that there should be different customs. Like, I ask people when I talk about the clans that Anishinaabe people have and the Haudenosaunee people have in Ontario, I say, out west, the Haida people, they have a killer whale clan. Why don't we have a killer whale clan in Ontario? Well, there's no killer whales here. So that's the best reason. When you look at totem poles that they have out west, they have animals on those poles that are very important to them. They're not necessarily have the same meaning as we do here in other parts of the country, because they weren't indigenous or native to our territories. So Some are the same, some aren't. We have frogs here. They have frogs in British Columbia, but we don't have killer whales here, and they do. So yeah, I hope that answers that.
That's great. So a couple questions here. They're the same, so I'm going to kind of put them together. They're wondering who made the wampum belts? Were there specific people for that job? And maybe even thinking about that, like if you can imagine how difficult it would be to carve out, remember the shell, to carve out a piece of that shell so that you could then carve it and make it into a bead. That's a big process. So if you can imagine how many beads are required for these huge wampum belts, it's a lot of work and effort. And so that's how important these are. So yeah, so the questions are, was there certain people that would make these belts?
Yes, and I've been taught that in many communities where they used them, that it was a woman's role, and there might have been specific people who had done this and knew how to do it. The oldest wampum belt that most people have seen is one called the 2-row wampum belt that the Haudenosaunee people exchanged over 400 years ago. And I don't think you can. I don't know whether you can see that. Yeah. And a lot of people associate wampum with Haudenosaunee people probably because that belt was first exchanged by them in what's now New York State with Dutch settlers. But many other nations have been associated with wampum belts. The Mi'kmaq people, in the Maritimes, Anishinaabe people here. And again, because of the shells being found in the ocean that make many of these belts and that were traded for by inland Indigenous peoples, there were more than just Haudenosaunee people that used them, but they had to. Everybody couldn't go out there and harvest shells from the sea. And again, that I showed you as a quag shell, they call it out there. That's just half, of course. There's another half, and then in the center was like a clam, a piece of meat. And you can still go into restaurants in some maritime cities and see quag on the menu. It's like a scallop. But after when the Indigenous peoples and the Europeans realized how important these beads were, the Europeans actually got into the business of manufacturing. They had factories that made wampum because they knew that the Indigenous peoples would trade for them. Sometimes one of the stereotypes, the myths, is that Indigenous peoples regard wampum beads as money, and you still hear people talk about wampum in some old Western movies. They were not money, but the Europeans often, or in the early days of North America settlement, because they didn't have much coinage or currency from Europe yet, they would often assign a value to pieces of wampum. The white wampum was not worth as much as the purple, and you can see why. The purple is a growth ring, and they would assign a value. So they assign values to different things, not just pieces of wampum. But it became easier for the Indigenous peoples to make wampum belts when they actually started to be manufactured and were more plentiful. Because if you were starting from scratch to make beads, some of these wampum belts would take months and months and months to make. A group of people, because if it took 2 days to craft one bead, you can see how long it would be. As I said, that big wampum belt from a major treaty, the Treaty of Niagara, that has 10,076 beads in. So they had to have a good supply on hand before they could start weaving them together.
So this question, and I'm just looking at the time here, we are coming towards the end of time. There's so many great questions that are rolling in. This one is from a grade 4 student, and they're wondering about the connection between treaties and residential schools. So I know you kind of touched on it at the end there with respect to Canada and governments not upholding their end of the bargain, or or keeping to their promises. Without going into, I mean, we could do a whole session just on this, and it is coming from a grade 4 class. So if you want to just maybe highlight some of the connections there.
Yeah, well, when the treaties were first made, one of the basic principles was that and I use the term Indians in the historic sense, because that mighty British Empire talked about the Indian tribes of North America. And in 1763, the King of England, the head of the British Empire, King George III, issued what's called the Royal Proclamation, and it said that the Indian tribes of North America were nations. Now, nations, that means that they regarded them the same as you might regard other nations like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and nations manage their own affairs. Unfortunately, what started to happen after the indigenous peoples in North America, remember when they first made the first treaties, they greatly outnumbered the Europeans. Once the Europeans started to come in great numbers, they started to outnumber the indigenous peoples. And when they outnumbered them, they didn't feel as obligated to keep the promises. They began to be more hungry for the land because there were more and more and more of them. So, when I said that in the early parts of the 1800s, there might have been only, 10, 15,000 Europeans in all of what we call Ontario. By 1850, there were 1 million. And the indigenous peoples had been weakened by their role in the War of 1812. They had started to succumb to all these diseases. They didn't have COVID then, but they had smallpox and influenza. And this decimated the indigenous populations because they had been immune, and they had no immunity to these diseases. So the balance of power shifted so that they were no longer equals. And by the time Canada decided to create a country in 1867, they started making laws that were designed to get the land away from the Indians. And they started making laws and rules. They thought that they could make all these indigenous peoples the same as they had been back in Europe. They wanted to make them all farmers. And they started a school system called the residential school system, which was part of the Indian Act. And they really thought they were going to eliminate indigenous culture by doing that. And they outlawed indigenous ceremonies. So these things were all in breach of the treaty promises. It goes without saying. And that's the residential schools are the worst part of that breaking treaty promises, which is represented by the Indian Act. And again, you'll be studying these things in more detail later, but the important thing is to know that Canada was formed on these promises of land sharing and of treating indigenous peoples as equals. And that was the start of what should have been a good relationship, but it has not evolved into as good a relationship. And you as students have to understand why that has happened and how we can make it better.
So it's really hard here because there's so many questions coming in. Maybe we'll do 2 more questions if that's okay with you.
Sure, I'm fine. Yeah.
And then we'll wrap it up. Just for those who are watching, I know if you do have to go, that's okay. This is being recorded, and I will share out the recording link afterwards for you all. Okay, so there was a couple questions around the use of guns. So did First Nations people have guns to use in the war? Coming from grade 5 students.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and until you might have heard of Samuel de Champlain. Um, he came to North America in the early 1600s, and the French were among the first people to come in great numbers. Jacques Cartier had been about 60 or 70 years before him. But as was so often the case, when the European people came, they made allies with certain indigenous tribes, and for different reasons, for trading reasons or whatever. And the French allied with the people called the Algonquins, and the Algonquins had a traditional enemy, the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee people, in what's now, they all used to live in what's now the United States, south of the Great Lakes. Now, many of them are north, such as down at Six Nations. And Champlain went on an excursion with the Algonquins, and they encountered in 1612, I think, they encountered Iroquois people in what's near what's now called Lake Champlain, and he fired a gun and killed 2 chiefs. That was, they say, one of the first, that they say that's the shot heard around the world, because the indigenous peoples didn't have weapons, maybe very rare weapons. But as they made alliances, and later the British came, and as they started trading for things like furs, then they would exchange for weapons. And you could appreciate that if an indigenous person was given a gun, even though they were archaic compared to what they are now, that it was a lot more likely they could shoot a big animal and bring them down with a gun than with a bow and arrow. But yes, they started trading for guns and ammunition, and in many cases, the Europeans were a bit nervous because they were afraid of the power of the indigenous peoples. In many cases, they were afraid for them to have guns in their hands, but the relationship was still pretty good, and so many of them came to have those weapons, which anything made out of metal made their lives easier. They used to tap maple syrup using birch bark baskets. Well, you can imagine the difference that might make if you had a metal pot. And so things like that, metal objects, and as we talked about making the wampum belts, when they came to have little metal tools like an awl, it became much easier to drill the holes in than whatever method they were using. And I've never talked to anybody who's made wampum belts who can satisfactorily tell me how they made those teeny holes in those little beads. So, but yes, they had guns.
Okay, so the question here is, why is a wampum belt called a wampum belt? And maybe this might be a good time to explain that it's not actually
A belt.
a belt.
Yeah, they were woven into. They called a belt because they sort of in the general shape of a belt. Some of them are bigger and longer than others, but they would be like a tapestry almost. That was maybe a more close description of them, or a wall hanging. But I've seen drawings and illustrations showing people carrying them, wearing them across their shoulder like a sash, but they weren't wrapped around their waist like a belt. And again, they were varying sizes. Some of them wouldn't even go around your waist. Some of them would go around your waist more than once. But the word wampum, I was taught, comes from a Narragansett word, and the Narragansett are a tribe of people in what we now call New England, and their word for white shell was wampanoag, and that's where I was taught the word wampum comes from, and it literally meant white shell, even though the shells could be different color, purple and white, or almost black and white in some cases, but that's where the word comes from.
And I think this will be our last question for this session. Comes from grade 3s, and they're curious to know, when was the first treaty agreement made? So maybe this would also be a good time to note that, and I know that you've mentioned this, that treaty making was something that was going on these lands here long before the Europeans even arrived. So yeah, so that's their question.
So that belt behind me, that dish with one spoon, that could have been, the better part of 400 years ago. I mentioned that that belt, the two-row wampum belt, was over 400 years old, but those are the first treaties that we know of with Europeans. But that again, that dish with one spoon behind me was made between First Nations again, before much of that settlement had started to move inland from the Atlantic coast, from the shores where they first landed. But as long as there have been Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, thousands of years, there had to be agreements between them. They might not have had wampum belts. They certainly didn't have paper, but they would remember, because part of the important role, there would be people whose job it was to remember the agreements and be able to recite them. They were called orators, and they would continually groom people whose job it was to remember things. And even today, when there are major ceremonies, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission handing down of its final report, there were Indigenous peoples there whose job was, and non-Indigenous, whose job it was to be official witnesses, and their job was to remember. Unfortunately, today, we live in a system where we rely on Google an awful lot to remember things for us, and our memories aren't as good. When I went to school, I can still recite In Flanders Fields verbatim because I remembered it many, many, many years ago. So our memory is an important tool because it calls on our heart to remember important things, and so Indigenous peoples have always used that as a way to recall what these important agreements meant. Sorry.
So we're wrapping up here for this morning's session. And is there any last words or as a final closing that you want to share with us, Morris?
Yeah, miigwech, Jody, and I want to thank everybody for listening to what I have to share with you today. And there's nothing more important in the world than education. Hopefully, when more and more people are educated, it will mean we have fewer and fewer wars to remember. And hopefully, when we have more and more people educated in Canada, we will have fewer broken treaty promises. And you're the future generation. I say that you're the pioneers of this education, because you're the first people in this country's history to learn a lot of these things that we're talking about today. And I wish you all good health and be safe in this uncertain time we're in. But I really wish you nothing but A's in all of your schoolwork, and hope that you're happy while you're learning. So miigwech nyawa.
Miigwech, Morris. So that's a big thank you on behalf of all of us here who've tuned in to listen. And we're very, very appreciative of your time today with us and all of the time that you have dedicated throughout your life in education to make this place a better place for all people. So thank you to everyone who's listened today. We hope that you will continue on with your learning journey and that you'll continue to have these important conversations and that you'll join us for future sessions as we have these throughout the year. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Stay